we were casting around for what to talk about, and the newspapers have caught up with population and demographic articles, charts, and I mean the FT is full of them, quite good details to the public. So we decided that we should follow them, and there's so much in the world connected with population these days, as we shall no doubt hear much more, that we thought we ought to go for a talk on population, demography, some of the tools and techniques that are going forward. And you can't look anywhere without finding applications. So we're very lucky to have with us tonight Dr. Paul Morland, who will guide us through some of the intricacies of the subject. Paul is somebody who spent a long time talking to the financial industry, cutting his teeth and advising people on in the financial area. And then he turned to demography, did some research at Birkbeck and I think Cambridge and Oxford too, and produced 4 rather well-received and penetrating books on different subjects within demography and its applications, and some of them raising quite important warnings about the future. So we're very lucky to have him, and I don't want to waste any more time. I think, Paul, it's ready. Over to you. Thank you very much for joining us here. I know it's not very far you've come, but it's nonetheless nice to see you. Over to you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for coming, and thank you for casting around and finding me and inviting me. So I trust everyone can hear me well. First of all, I must make 2 apologies. The first apology is that for the last 6 weeks or so, I've had a hip problem, as a result of which I am addressing you sitting down rather than standing up, which would be a more normal position when I give a talk, probably pacing up and down. Secondly, I've got the end of a cough, which your colleague Martin thinks he gave me, but since I've had it for several weeks and I only met Martin several minutes ago, I think he's taking rather too much on his shoulders. So I won't detain you talking about whether demography is a science or what the nature of science is or what a natural or a social science is. I don't think that's terribly interesting, but hopefully there's enough in demography to get you interested and realise that it's a discipline everyone should know something about. So I want to start just by giving you a little bit of autobiography, a demographic autobiography, how I got onto this subject. People ask me why I ever got interested in the subject in the first place. I'm afraid I'm one of those despicable Oxford PPEists. That means I can't never remember whether I know everything about nothing or nothing about everything. But one way or another, I did PPE. I went and worked in the financial industry, and then 6 years later went back to Oxford to do a master's in international relations, wrote a thesis on the oil industry, and really have had this sort of vague interest in demography. I got married in 1992, and I noticed very different fertility choices of our friends. Some were not interested in having children at all, some were having very large families, and so I sort of thought, why is that, and what influence will it have? Tucked it away in the back of my mind, really. And then, as a consultant in the financial services industry, I had a very quiet 2008, 2009. And I decided I would do my PhD thesis, something that I had promised myself as a treat for my retirement. But at that point, I was in my late 40s, not ready to retire in any manner or by any means. But I thought, well, you know, if I can't find any work in financial services and consulting for the time being, why not start writing my PhD thesis? So I found my perfect PhD supervisor, a chap called Eric Kaufman. I don't know if any of you have read his stuff. A funny story whereby I found the perfect supervisor who was spending a year at Harvard at the time, and thought I'd get in touch with him and did a bit of research about him and found that his PhD supervisor had been a theorist of nationalism called Anthony Smith, who was a neighbour and very close friend of mine. And his PhD supervisor was a man called Ernest Gellner. I don't know whether you know any of these names. But anyway, I wrote to Eric and said, this is what I'd like to do. And by the way, I'm a friend of your PhD supervisor, Anthony. And as they say, it's not who you know, but what you know, or is it what you know? But anyway, I was on. So I wrote, as soon as Eric was back from his period at Harvard, I got busy again. So we started the PhD, but I managed to work 4 days a week and do my PhD on the other days. And the other thing, at that point, I had 3 children, and the youngest had just gone into secondary school, which is a moment when a lot of parents find, having had very busy lives, they actually have a bit more time. So I wrote my PhD thesis, and it was published as a book called Demographic Engineering, Population Strategies and Ethnic Conflict. And then I thought, nobody's really written a good history of demography, asking what's changed and how it's driven the whole of history. So there are lots of really interesting articles, but a sort of panoramic view. The last thing I found was a book published in 1947 in the London Library called L'Histoire de la Population Mondiale, the history of the global population, published in 1947, so I thought it needed an update. And I also wanted to write a book. I mean, Demographic Engineering, I think it's a good book, but it's a PhD thesis. It was published by an academic publisher. It wasn't priced for or written for general consumption. I mean, probably many of the people in this room are quite happy reading PhD theses, but there is a difference. So I found a general publisher and wrote The Human Tide, which really says 200 years, what happened in demography and how did it drive the history of the world. And then I thought, well, if it's driven the history of the world, it must be driving the contemporary world. And so I wrote Tomorrow's People. And Tomorrow's People really says, well, that's the history. Where are we now? What are the big changes going on in demography? And then, as I was writing that, it occurred to me we did have a big problem with not having enough kids, something that I have written about a lot. I wrote an article in the Sunday Times in July 2022, which they chose to entitle, Is It Time to Tax the Childless? So that didn't go down very well. There was what was known as a Twitter storm. I had never heard the term before. A friend of mine said it's clickbait. I'd never heard that term before. But anyway, you live and learn, and I thought, well, that was such a controversial article. Surely there's a book in it. So I decided to write No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. It was originally entitled Procreate or Perish, but my publisher decided that was a bit too Old Testament, so we called it No One Left. So what I want to do tonight is really run you through, I'm not going to talk about demographic engineering, because that's a sort of separate topic, really, but run you through reasonably briefly my 3 books, and the last 3 books, and what I had discovered, and why I think everyone should know something about this topic. So, the thing about demography is you need a bit of theory, and a bit of theory gets you an awfully long way. So this is the only bit of theory I'm going to introduce you to. And you may well have learnt something like this at school. And I've slightly amended it because I've used this term pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, which I think is original. And I think it's quite useful. So I think of 3 phases, and these phases are different times in different places. So at any one time, different countries can be at different phases. There's what I call the pre-modern, and that's essentially the world of Thomas Malthus. You may have learned about Thomas Malthus again at school. Very simply, Malthus's view was this. Let's imagine every couple averages 6 children. So you triple each generation. And let's imagine that a generation is 25 years, so you triple and triple and triple and triple in the course of a century. Now, I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation for what I hope will be my next book. And if you did that from a standing start in the year 1, that is when there was about 250 million people in the world, by the start of what we now call the Dark Ages, I think about 400, maybe 500, you would have had 1 square metre per person. So Malthus said you've got this extraordinary pressure, but it's meeting the immovable objects of the capacity of the planet, not actually to stand, that was obviously far beyond its capacity, but to feed people. And the population may bob up and down depending on wars and famines and catastrophes and plagues, But ultimately, there's a very slow moving upward slope on what the planet can do. And there's this extraordinary pressure on that, because each generation will probably triple naturally. One thing I would point out that's interesting about that is that, talking to a scientific audience, is that according to Darwin, his eureka moment was reading Malthus. And he said, he was reading Malthus on the beetle, and he said, well, if that's true of humans, it's true of all species, as indeed Malthus acknowledged. And if all species are endlessly banging up against this sort of theoretical constraint, they must be under a great discipline. And how does that discipline then shape those species? So there's a very interesting link between Malthus and Darwin, which I'm obviously not going to have time to talk about this evening. So that's the way everyone thought the world was forever. And then something happened, the Industrial Revolution. People the whole of Europe managed to open up the globe to shipping in food from the prairies, from Australia. The food constraints lifted, agricultural productivity rose, and public health advanced, and people started living longer. Think of it as a railway station. Initially, lots of people are turning up and lots of people are being carted off on the trains. It's high fertility, high mortality, and a small number of people on the platform. At first, the trains stop leaving. People are staying on the platform longer. They're living longer. The platform fills up. Eventually, the number of people arriving declines. And so you go from high fertility, high mortality, small population, to low fertility, low mortality, high population. And that, in essence, is the demographic transition. Now, it's a very controversial thesis. People think it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply everywhere. What about France in the 18th century? A huge literature, very interesting literature on that. But take it as a broad model for what goes on. And if you asked me in 1970, what is a country's life expectancy, or its fertility rate, or its infant mortality rate, I would say, tell me its GDP per capita, and I'll give you a good answer. There was a very good correlation. That's modernity. Where are you on that socioeconomic transition? That determines where you are demographically. We're now in a postmodern world. So we're in a world where not all the world, but most of the world, more and more of the world, has got through that transition. And then what matters is culture. Everybody lives reasonably long. I mean, I was looking today, the life expectancy gap between America and India, say, has halved in the last 40, 50 years. Because the United States is sort of about 80, and lots of third world countries, what we would have called third world countries, have caught up. Fertility rates have tumbled in developing countries to the point, it's not like you just get richer and richer and your fertility rate goes lower. Once you're through that transition, it's cultural factors that actually determine your fertility rate. So we're in what I now call post-modernity, which is where it's no longer about material conditions, but about cultural conditions that really determines the key issue. Once everyone's living to a reasonable age, once infant mortality is very low, and that is how many children do you have. So I just want to talk relatively briefly, this is the kind of human tide part of the talk, to show you how history has been driven by demography. And I'm just going to take a few incidents from the historical record. So in the first decade of the 19th century, the Louisiana Purchase occurred and the United States expanded vastly into what was then French territory. And if you, people sometimes say, well, why did Napoleon sell this really valuable piece of real estate? The answer was that in the relatively young United States, originally Atlantic-hugging colonies that were moving out, there were 100 people for every French émigré or person of French origin in the area of the Louisiana Purchase. For reasons I can't go into now, the French had not had a population explosion and it was pretty empty. And Napoleon realized that demography alone meant that the United States was going to roll across this area. Moving forward to the First World War, I think there's an interesting story about the causes of the war. So the French, particularly from 1870, 71, paranoid about German demography, the Germans paranoid about Russian demography. What was actually happening is that this wave of transition was moving from France to Germany to Russia. Demographic paranoia definitely fed into the war, something I detail in The Human Tide. And actually, if you simply look at the mobilized forces of the two sides, which were in line with their populations, it would have been very difficult for the Central Powers to win, given that this was a war of two sides, at least on the Western Front, grinding against each other with very similar technologies. Not all wars simply depend on who has the larger population, but it's a pretty important phenomenon very often. Rolling forward again, I'm just picking a few incidents to show you how history has actually been influenced by demography. The Russians got to this demographic transition and expansion of the Russian population in the very early years of the 20th century. And they assumed, because people didn't really understand, they assumed, well, even the Marxists, even the Soviets, kind of thought the Russians are the leading people in the Soviet Union, we're obviously expanding, and we'll grow and grow and grow, and others will kind of accrete to us. But Russia was through that. The small size of Russian families really from the 30s and 40s, never mind the sort of extraordinary loss of life between the time of the revolution and the end of the Second World War. So Russia had got a long life expectancy, but it was now having much smaller families. And it was the peoples of Central Asia and the Caucasus, largely Muslim people, who were growing very fast. They were now into their early phase of rising life expectancy, massive growing populations. And when the 1970 census came out and showed that the Russians were declining as a share of the Soviet population, this was a huge blow to the self-confidence of the Russians within the Soviet Union. And also it made it very difficult to raise an army to fight in Afghanistan, as the Habsburgs had discovered armies that are multilingual are difficult to manage. So this just shows you the fertility rate of Uzbekistan and Russia in the Soviet Union. And you can imagine if everyone, if mass infant mortality is ending, then in a place like Uzbekistan, then the Uzbeks are going to be growing very, very rapidly. And despite the Soviet rhetoric of the brothership of all mankind, this did worry the Russians very much. They rolled out pronatal policies. And they said they were going to roll it out to the whole country, but conveniently they just rolled it out to Russia and said, well, it will go to other areas eventually, but it never did. That within all our, most people in this room's living memory, Japan was the land of the rising sun. Again, they had huge population growth, and then suddenly very small families from the 60s. Japan really fell off the cliff economically and financially at the end of the 80s, precisely when their working age population started to decline. So all this has effects for markets and economies. And since the Japanese population started to decline, particularly the workforce, that's the blue, the red is, the sort of reddish colour is the young population, the blue is the working age, and the green is the elderly. Since that working age started to decline, Japan has really stopped being the dynamic exemplar of economic growth that those of us who were interested in these things in the 70s and 80s remember. It was a Japanese moment, and it was a demographic moment. So, as I say, I was just trying to pick some incidents from the past to show how sometimes demography can be moving and affecting events we're familiar with in ways we don't know or we're not familiar with. And if you're interested in more on that, by all means do read The Human Tide. So much for the past. What about the present and future? Now, the way I organised my third book, which was Tomorrow's People, was to say there is a pattern of demographic progress. Instead of following the history, let's look at the world today and see who's where at a given point in time. So the first thing that happens as you start to move into that demographic transition is your infant mortality rate comes down. In many societies, a quarter or a third of children would die before the age of 1, and far more than that would die before the age they reach to reproduce themselves. And if you read, I was looking at the story of Gustav Mahler, for example, the other day. He was one of 12 or 14 children, I can't remember, and half of them didn't make it out of childhood. So, and indeed, this is the whole Malthusian point. If you have very large families, the population of the world would explode if it weren't for the fact that many, many die before they have the opportunity to procreate themselves. Well, today in development, the first thing people focus on is getting infant mortality rates down. And we've made, as humanity, we've made fantastic progress on this. Sierra Leone, I think, has the highest infant mortality rate in the world. Back in the 50s, it was at about 1 in 4, 250 per thousand. Today, it's below 100. It's probably pretty much below 50 as we speak. Implement some basic programs. It's sort of 80-20 rule, and you bring infant mortality rate down very quickly. When I was writing the book, the infant mortality rate in Peru, which has fallen very quickly, was, I think, between a half and a third of what it had been in Britain when I was born in 1964. So countries that are still quite poor are making very, very fast progress on this. And we know it's about hygiene, it's about educating women on looking after children. There are some basic things, now relatively cheap things you can do, which get infant mortality tumbling. And then you have a country like Japan, South Korea, where it's barely 2 per thousand. So low that any further progress will make very little difference. Demographically, of course, every child spared is a miracle. So, what happens when infant mortality falls? You have massive population growth. And the place that really exemplifies this today is sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got infant mortality coming down, and fertility rates are still quite high. Now, the fertility rates in Africa are by no means one picture. They're very varied. North of the Sahara, they've fallen. South Africa's been in what I would call the Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold area of 2 to 3, 4 decades. Some countries in East Africa, it's falling fast. But nevertheless, it's still got the highest fertility rates in the world, particularly West and Central Africa. And between about 1950 and the end of the coming century, the population of Africa will have grown from about 7% of the world to about 35% of the world. Now, that's a very different world. The culture will be different. The strategic dimensions will be different. The economy will be different if you go from 7% to 35%. It's a huge challenge for many African countries. They have these buoyant populations. The real reason they're having buoyant populations is not because they're having bigger families than ever. They've always had big families. It's because they've brought their infant mortality rate down and their life expectancy is growing dramatically. And the point of this, by the way, is so many stories in the news, when you read about them, there is actually a demographic component, just as there was in the history. So when you have a very rapidly growing population on the one hand, but only a fixed amount of land and more productive agriculture, people go to the cities. And it's one of those things a lot of us learned about in the history books with the Industrial Revolution, people moving from the countryside to the cities. It's happened enormously in much of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. It was happening in Asia until relatively recently. If the population of the country is growing, the population of the cities is growing much faster. All the growth is going into the cities, and you get these extraordinarily big places like Lagos with tens of millions of people. When my grandparents were born or young before the First World War, there were, I think, 12 cities in the world with 1 million people. You would have known the names of them: Tokyo, Paris, London, New York. Today there are more than 500, many of them in China, most of them places we'd never have heard of. So you get a fall in infant mortality, you get a boom in the population, and up goes the urbanization and the rise of cities. Now, when people are in cities, they become different people. There's a German expression, apparently a medieval German expression, Stadtluft macht frei, which is the air of the towns liberates people. Now, I'm not sure free is really the right word, but the mentality of urban people, we forget, because people who live in the countryside in Britain are just as modern, just as urban in some ways, people who live in the cities. But in a country that's developing, the people who come in from the countryside are more likely to get an education, more likely to pursue a career. Their children are become assets they want to invest in. A child in the countryside who's never going to get an education, you might have another one. If you're in the city and you think, well, if I could send this child to school, he or she might get a decent job. So people invest in their children. There are a whole range of theories as to why urban people have smaller families, but they certainly do. Singapore, of course, always urban, but still had large families back in the 50s. Now, probably about one child per woman. Germany, constantly urban through the period we're looking at, very low fertility rate, and a still largely rural country like Nigeria, only beginning to see a fall in its fertility rate. So it's precisely the large families and the fall in infant mortality which gives rise to the booming population, which gives rise to the urbanization, and then slows down. And so as the population gets older, or rather as it has fewer children and it lives longer, it gets older, the median age is a good way of capturing this. Line up the population, how old's the person in the middle. In Japan, it's gone up from something like 20 to something like 45 since 1950. In Chad, it's actually fallen because you're keeping more of your children alive. In China, it's rising quickly. We are going to see many countries with a median age of 50 or above in the coming decades. And this also has very serious consequences. I have a house, as I was telling to people at dinner, in French Catalonia, which is like down by the Spanish border. It is France, but it is Catalonia, something not everyone appreciates. And I went over to Catalonia when they had that vote on independence. And it occurred to me that there was, how very different this was to the Catalonia described by George Orwell. Anarchy, communism, revolution, civil war. No one was doing anything very much. And I looked round in Port Boo, and it was a lot of old, elderly people sitting drinking their coffees. No one took their Armalites up into the Pyrenees. The median age of Catalonia in George Orwell's day, 25, today about 45. So the whole political dynamic changes as the population gets older. Crime comes down. I mean, there are positive things. And just as when you have population growth, the urban growth is huge. When you have aging of the population, the very old rise exponentially. There are about 80,000 people aged over 100 in Japan. Back in 1960, there was almost nobody. And this, of course, gives rise. It's what a wonderful thing if you enjoy life. And maybe none of us wants to live to 100, but in any one given day, nobody wants to die. So there's a contradiction, but I think it's something to celebrate lengthening life. But it does give rise to challenges. Japan has the highest debt to GDP in the developed world because it has so many old people who need pensions, who need healthcare, and fewer taxpayers. And also, as Japan has got older, I'm afraid it's got much less creative, much less inventive. You can see it in the GDP figures. You can see it in the patent submissions. And eventually the population will decline. A country like Bulgaria, for example, very, very long period of very low fertility rate. Part of the EU so people can leave and go to much wealthier countries. Not an attractive place for people to go to as immigrants. So the population of Bulgaria is already falling and has fallen significantly, perhaps 30% already. That's true of other countries in the Balkans, such as Macedonia. It's going to be true of lots and lots of places. China could lose 40% of its population before the end of the century. Now, in Britain, we still have more births than deaths until last year. We've now got more deaths than births. The only reason we don't have a rapid fall in our population, or at least an accelerating fall, is immigration. If you don't want a falling population and your fertility rate has been low for a long time, you have to have immigration. A good example of that is the US, not the lowest fertility rate by any means in the developed world, but nevertheless a country with very, very long-standing, relatively low fertility and a huge appetite for labour. And so the United States, the complexion of the United States has completely changed. And I think if you want to understand the phenomenon of Trump, for example, part of it is the white majority, I think, coming to terms with the fact that its demographic preponderance is declining. If you want to understand Brexit, there's a very strong correlation with voting in favour of Brexit and being concerned about mass immigration. So along with the challenge of falling birth rates, falling population, falling workforces met by mass immigration and very rapid ethnic change, you are having ethnicity, ethnic change, immigration become a huge part of politics in France, in Germany, in Britain, in America, across the world. Again, if you want to understand the politics of the contemporary developed world, you need to understand the massive ethnic change that's happening and the causes behind it. So, two slightly non-demographic things I want to talk about briefly are the fact that whilst the quantity of people is growing at a much slower rate, in much of the world we're seeing qualitative uptick of an extraordinary level. Take a country like Bangladesh. When it got its independence in the early 70s, even as late as the early 80s, fewer than 20% of women were literate. Today, the only illiterate people in Bangladesh are the elderly. And if you look at university entrance, in China, 1980, almost no one went to university. Today, almost half the cohort do. So whatever we are looking at in terms of the numbers, particularly when we're thinking about economics, in the developing world, we also have to think about the extraordinary advance in the human capital that is out there. In the developed world, it's slightly different because you could argue we're already more or less at the frontier. Of course, our education could always get better, but we don't have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of peasants as they have in China who could still be brought into the productive economy. The other thing is none of this would have been possible without an extraordinary transformation of agriculture. We have not hit another Malthusian limitation. We ate better when we were 2 billion than when we were 1 billion. We ate better when we were 4 billion than when we were 2 billion, and we're eating better now. The world has more than enough food to feed everyone well. We hear much less about famines than we did when I was a child. And the population of the world is growing slower and slower. That's the yellow line at the bottom. It looks flat, but of course it's not a logarithmic scale, so it's actually the growth rate's declining. And meanwhile, we have made extraordinary progress in our ability to create food. So I just want to say a word about what I call the demographic trilemma. And the examples I use here are Israel, Britain, and Japan because they have very distinct demographies. And the way I argue it, it's a bit controversial, I say there are 3 E's: economic dynamism, ethnic continuity, and egotism. There may be those, and we see it in how people are voting, whether we like it or not, who do not wish to have massive ethnic change. There are those who do not wish to be changing nappies at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there are those who wish to keep the economic lights on. And my argument is you can have 2 but not 3 of those. If you're Britain, you want to keep the lights on, you want the economy to grow, you want to be finding people to work in nursing homes and in the healthcare service, but you don't want large families. And that means you do have to have very rapid immigration and ethnic change. The Japanese, meanwhile, also don't want large families, but they are not prepared to countenance mass immigration, although there is more immigration now in Japan than there was. And the result is, as we've seen, there has been demographic decline. Israel is the only country in the OECD, they've got through the demographic transition, they're in the postmodern world, and they have nearly 3 children per woman. No other OECD country has more than 2. So, I could give you a 45-minute talk on why that's the case, and there are many theories. But essentially, by choosing to forego the egotism, if you like, of the small family, and it's a controversial word, but, the 3 E's are sort of an easy thing to remember, they are able to not to need mass immigration and to keep the economy chugging along. So that's just a sort of a way of thinking about the trade-offs. As people, for example, talk a lot about, I've actually been on the BBC a lot, I've been on GB News a lot, I was on actually 2 days ago with Jacob Rees-Mogg, I've been on with Nigel Farage, and I've said to people who are particularly concerned about immigration, Matt Goodwin, who I know quite well, you need to think about fertility rates, not just about immigration. And you need to think about support ratios. And you need to think about how many children people are prepared to have and how the economy will develop. So it's a challenge to people on the left and the right, I think. I try to keep it apolitical. Just a couple of things I want to talk about briefly on my latest book, No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. And many people say, surely we've got a large enough population, we don't need more. I think the essential problem is not the size of the population, but the balance of the population. Japan reached 100 million people in the mid-1960s. And when it had 100 million people, it had about 10 people of working age, let's say 20 to 65, to over 65. So the ability of the economy to reasonably remunerate those of working age and at the same time look after the people of retired age was very easy. 10 workers have on their shoulders one retiree. When it gets, so it's gone up, and for obvious reasons which we've talked about, it's gone down. When it gets back to 100 million in the middle of this century, people may say, well, Japan was doing very nicely back in the 1960s. When it had 100 million, it's gone up, it goes back down. When it goes back down to 100 million, what's the problem? And my answer is that when it gets back down to 100 million, the so-called old age dependency ratio will be nearly 100% or 85%. That means there'll be barely one worker for every retiree. And I don't know how a society or an economy is going to function. The Prime Minister before last of Japan spoke about societal collapse. So Japan is ahead of the pack, but we're all heading there, and countries like Britain, the United States, most of Europe, have very, very low fertility rates that are falling. And the interesting thing is it's no longer a rich man's luxury or a rich woman's luxury to have small families. You might be surprised to know that in Thailand, they have almost exactly the same fertility rate as Britain. And Jamaica, they have a lower fertility rate, or maybe it's the other way around. India, much of India has a fertility rate similar or lower to Britain's. Some of the Indian states, Punjab, West Bengal, Kerala. Some have higher, but overall India is now below 2, or it's heading below 2. So what was once associated with the developed world, i.e. small families, is now spreading across the world. Of all the United States and territories, the one with the lowest fertility rate is Puerto Rico, which reminds me always of the famous song from West Side Story, always the money owing, always the population growing, or words to that effect for those of you who know it. And back in the 50s, Puerto Rico would probably have had the highest fertility rate in the United States. The idea that people in the poor and developing worlds have large families is true in part, but it's also untrue in part. I read this week that the fertility rate in Chile, not a poor country, but by no means a developed country, is now similar to that of South Korea. 2 people make 0.8 of a person. So each cohort halves. That is humanity going down the plug hole, effectively. And at the same time, as I've said, whilst the whole population is shrinking, you have this extraordinary takeoff of the elderly. And the number of people in the world who are aged over 80 has grown exponentially. This is thousands, so there'll be 250 million 90-somethings in the middle of this century in the world. There were such a small number back in as recently as 1960, you could hardly count them on the fingers of one hand. So to wrap up, what I've tried to suggest is, number one, demography is a system, it's a process that's quite easy to understand, about stocks and flows, really. Secondly, that whether you want to understand history or contemporary affairs or how the world is developing, whether you're looking at the past or the future, present or the future, having some concept of how demography works is going to enlighten you and add an extra lens, an extra dimension to your understanding of the world. And that is my mission in writing the 4 books I've written, and I hope to write another couple to help people understand how population, its rise, its fall, and its movements affects just about everything from economics to politics to society and the economy. Thanks very much.
Right. Do we have any questions. Are you happy to have questions?
Delighted to have
Of
questions.
course you are. Paul.
Thanks very much, and very interesting talk. It's reassuring to know that food is in abundance. Does your research cover housing? Is that a pattern that is discernible?
So housing is a controversial topic because among pronatalists, people who think we should have more children, there is a question of how important housing is. And on the one hand, we all know, I mean, those of us with children, I've got 3 children of my own, and they're all married now, and they've all got their own homes, and 2 sets have started their own families. And we know what an extraordinary challenge that is. On the other hand, if you look at Britain, and you look at the different regions of Britain, there is no correlation between the cost of housing and the fertility rate. In the parts of Scotland where housing is quite cheap, the fertility rate is among the lowest in the country. There are countries where housing is cheap and the fertility rate is low. So the first thing I would say is, in a country like Britain, if we want to get our fertility rate up, we have to sort out housing for young people. But if we sort out housing for young people, it is only a sufficient but not a necessary condition. In other words, I think we have to do it by hook or by crook, but that will not in itself solve the problem. And unlike food, I think there was always a sense in the Malthusian world that there was an absolute limit to the food that could be produced. Now, there's not an absolute limit to the housing that we could create. I always say if you land at Stansted Airport or Gatwick Airport, not far from London, there's acres and acres of space. Now, I don't think the whole country should be filled up, but I can't remember what percentage of the country is covered with housing. It's a tiny percentage. Now, of course, with housing, more housing, you need more roads, you need more ports, you need more shops, etc. But the amount of space we could add in this, whether we want to or not, is another question. There is no absolute constraint on space. You've got countries, huge countries like Australia, which have terrible housing shortages. So it's largely an issue about planning, an issue about transport. It's not an absolute constraint in the way that food is. Having said that, I do agree, unless we sort out housing, we can't begin to address the very low fertility rate we have in this country and other countries.
Fascinating talk, thank you. So, I mean, maybe you've already done this, but if you were advising Sir Keir Starmer in respect of, you know, his policies with the aspect of demography, how would you be advising him?
Well, I used to say that in this country we've had 50 years of below replacement fertility, and we've never had a politician who's talked about it. A frontline politician. I mean, there are politicians, I'm pleased to say, a couple of politicians I know, Miriam Cates, who was an MP, has talked about it. Neil O'Brien, who's the Tory frontbench spokesman on education, is very interested in this. But until now, we haven't had a frontline government politician who's ever said a word on the subject. Contrast that to Macron, who says we need a demographic crusade. And France has got better demography than we have. Or now J.D. Vance, who says we need more children. So we have front-ranking politicians overseas who talk about the subject. In Britain, it's a bit of a taboo subject. But finally, that's changed. We now have a Prime Minister who has spoken on the subject. And what has he said? I'm not going to tell people how many children to have. So, first of all, that's a complete Aunt Sally, because no one's telling. I mean, I don't know. I know all sorts of shades of pronatalists, particularly in the States, from a sort of traditional Catholic type to the kind of techno-modernist. So that's a complete red herring as far as I'm concerned. I would say, I mean, I was on a channel the other day, and I was asked about detailed policy prescriptions. And I could talk a lot about them, what Hungary has tried, what France has tried, what the Soviet Union tried, what Cuba tried, left-wing countries, right-wing countries. But what I do say is that before I get into a debate on the details of policy, it's almost like saying, I want a really beautifully designed railway engine, but we have no intention of building any tracks. So my focus is very much on saying to the government, can you at least acknowledge this is an issue? By the way, I think the world is really catching on. I mean, the FT of all journals seems to have the bit between the teeth on this. My last book, I saw the day the review came out, I thought, oh, you know, it's going to be a complete slagging off. And it was one of my best reviews was in the FT. They're taking this subject really, really seriously. The Economist has always taken it seriously. So I'm pleased to say what I would call the kind of mainstream centre-left media is catching on to this. The politicians are not. I want the politicians to acknowledge it's an issue. That alone would start to move the dial. Then we can get into the discussion. Is it about child benefit? Is it about women's rights in the workplace? Is it about the culture? Is it about the cap on child benefit? Is it about taxation policies? It's a really interesting policy debate to be had. How much can policy do versus culture? Can politicians shape the culture? Almost pointless to have that discussion when the politicians haven't even opened the Overton window, never mind moved it.
But what advice would you give Keir Starmer about immigration?
About immigration? Well, what I would say about immigration is, first of all, that before we get very severe constraints on immigration, we should understand the relationship between immigration and fertility, and that if you don't have immigration, and we carry on with the fertility rates we have now, we'll have a declining population and a rapidly aging population. The second thing I would say to him, and this is perhaps a bit off my topic, is that the public are extremely concerned about immigration, and that whilst we do need immigrants for demography.
Hi, I was wondering if I could ask you about potential paradigm shifts or game changers. As you pointed out, if you look at food production, we've repeatedly stymied people who look at curves and fail to forecast that humans are kind of adaptive and come up with clever game-changing ideas. If you think about your model, I was wondering what kind of things might change it significantly. So the Japanese might have said automation or AI. If, for example, some bright biomedical spark were to significantly reduce aging, right, by comparison to the increased life expectancy, some of those things I'd have thought might significantly change again. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what might change the model effectively.
So the first thing is that, thank you, very good question. The first thing is that demography can surprise people. And the great example of that was the post-war baby boom. So if you read people like Keynes writing in the 30s, by 1930, Britain had a fertility rate of about 2, and we had a much higher infant mortality rate. People were really concerned about that. And people like Keynes understood the link to the economy, and then we had a post-war baby boom. And again, lots of ink's been spilled on why we had a post-war baby boom. The Americans had one. Ours was slightly different in its shape and its size. But so I don't despair. I think demography can surprise us. Let's assume, though, we continue to head towards an ever lower fertility rate. I think you've put your finger on two things, probably the two most prominent things that could save us, which would be technology and a shift in how we age so that we work longer. But I would say too, and you know, that I think those things will be necessary. On AI, I'm very skeptical. I've got a chapter on AI in my book. I think AI will change the workplace, and it will change an awful lot. I'm very skeptical that it will remove the requirement for labour. One of the things you see, if you're on the cusp of a breakthrough that is going to allow you to create the world's economy with half the workers or a third of the workers, you'd see productivity gains. You'd see per hour worked more and more GDP. And notoriously, those countries that are in the forefront of economics, the most developed countries, are seeing very, very sluggish productivity growth. So for all the new technology, it's not yet moving the dial on productivity. And you could say, oh, well, AI is just coming in. But, you know, the internet, the PC, the internet, the robots, we're all supposed to revolutionize. And here we are with sluggish economic growth, with mass immigration, and still labor shortages everywhere. So I'm very scared. And why is that? Well, you know, I think partly it's because we've got a very service-oriented economy. If you actually look at what AI can do, there's very good research which suggests that AI will take out a lot of, there are always new technologies taking out jobs and new jobs being created. There's an awful lot that goes on in the economy that cannot be substituted by AI. So the example I give to you two examples. My mother-in-law was in an old age home until she died just over a year ago. And you look around the old age home, I've read about the new technologies that have come in Japan and they've been abandoned. It's really hard to get significant. I mean, there are some new things like better sensors in the rooms. It's an awful lot of looking after old people at this stage, and as far as the eye can see, and that's going to be an increasing part of the economy, is very hands-on. The other example I give is my house in France. We needed a new roof, and we got roofers in, and they worked extremely hard in the heat of the day, and I looked at what they were doing, and I thought, they've come in a van, they could have done that 60 years ago. They've used electricity, they could have done that 80 years ago. So much of the economy is like this, that's my point. I can't see that AI, and I can't see any of the technological advances of the last 50 years have significantly changed how they do the roof tiling. Now, it may be the cutting of the tiles, way upstream there's been some gains. But I think more and more of the economy, because we've advanced technologically, is very, very hands-on. And I'm not sure that AI is going to solve the problem. And in any case longer, but people don't actually want to work longer, many people. And I think many people in this room will be parts of professions or careers which are exciting and demanding, and they enjoyed them. But it's still the case that a lot of people don't like work. And if you try and move the retirement date, two things I'd say. First of all, moving the retirement date when you're going from 10 workers per retiree to 1 worker per retiree is very, very small beer. Secondly, the political pushback is enormous. Macron tried to move the retirement age. Putin has tried to, and they both made very, very small, compared to the demographic chasm their countries are facing. The progress is very small. It's really difficult to do politically. Not impossible, but I'm not sure that getting the fertility rate up wouldn't be an easier solution than getting the retirement rate up.
Actually, what I was going to ask follows from, in a way, is relevant to what you were just saying about dependency ratio and how you calculate what is dependency. And as you just saying, if people are perfectly capable of working until they're 70 or 80, that affects the way you calculate the dependency ratio. And of course, what assumptions are you making in terms of what people do? They're not working in the formal sense, the way that we count it in the economy, but of course, a lot of people, once they retire, they do a lot of work which is not counted in the national statistics. And in fact, the new retired are looking after the older, the very old people, and doing a range of work, and they continue doing bits. But they're not paid, it's not visible, but somehow, surely it would affect the way you look at the dependency ratio.
I think you're absolutely right. So we have a very static view of the dependency ratio, which is roughly 20 to 65-year-olds over, or rather 65 pluses over 20 to 65-year-olds. And I completely appreciate that's a very static view of seeing the world. When you have this kind of change, moving the thing out will help, but it won't. It doesn't reverse a 10-to-1 to a 1-to-1 ratio. I think you're absolutely right about the informal sector, that a lot of older people do a lot of very valuable work. Of course, it doesn't get taxed, and that's what the politicians are interested in, because they're desperate for revenue. They're desperate to pay for doctors and nurses in the NHS. And if you're doing lots of great voluntary work, you're not getting an income, and it's not getting taxed. The government doesn't take a slice of it, so it doesn't sort of help the government's fiscal problem. But I do think, and this is my perspective very much as a relatively new grandparent, that one of the most valuable things you can do if you are lucky enough to have grandchildren is help your children with those grandchildren, because that makes the whole process of parenthood much easier. And I think that's going to be one of the keys to increasing the fertility rate, is having more participative grandparents.
Hello. Can I just also say, if I could ask a question, two things I'd just like to ask, if I may. One is what you think of resources, because obviously in the past, resources were distributed in a different way. Now there are resources are quite limited in certain ways, say, aluminium, etc. So to what extent that will affect the population? And then secondly, what your view is on the shift of the population taking advantages of places, new places, and especially places like the UAE?
I can answer on the resources. I'm not entirely clear on the UAE question, so perhaps I can answer resources and you can come back and clarify your question. I don't know if you're familiar with the economist Julian Simon, who died, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And he had a famous bet with Paul Ehrlich, who's the kind of Malthusian doomster. And Julian Simon won the bet. And Simon's basic view was, when things get short, the price goes up. When the price goes up, people are incentivized to find alternatives and also to find more of the product. So when I'm old enough to remember the 1973 oil shock, and we were told we're running out of oil, and the world's going to run out of oil, and it's going to be a disaster. And we have more proven reserves of oil now, after decades of massively burning oil, than we had back then. Now, you can talk, global warming's another question, but in terms of are we running out of oil, almost everyone agrees that we are going to just leave huge amounts of the oil we found in the ground, given the progress we're making on renewable energy. And I read a really interesting pamphlet, I think it's from about the 1880s, by a very famous economist back then called Jevons, probably one of the founders of economics, sort of big influence ultimately on the whole Cambridge School of Economics. And he said, we're running out of coal. And the whole of our industrial revolution, which has been going on for the last 100 years, the whole of the British advantage in building the kind of economy we built is coal, and we're going to run out of it, and we need to start saving it. And again, I'm old enough to remember when, we shut all these mines, and we've got hundreds, perhaps thousands of years of coal in the ground in Britain, and we're never going to use it. So I think the ultimate resource, to use Julian Simon's title, is the human brain and human ingenuity. And I'm skeptical that we're going to run out of anything. I mean, we were going to run out of food, and now we've got more food than we need. So I'm a bit skeptical on the I don't think resources are going to be a problem. I think if you get to the world of Korea, where each cohort is a third of the size of the last one for a few generations, it's the ultimate resource. It's the human ingenuity and brain power that's going to run out. But your question on the UAE, I mean, I think the UAE is a very interesting model, but I don't think it's going to be a place that hundreds of millions of people move to. Right. Well, I've been lucky enough to be invited both to speak in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, so I've been out there. The funny thing was when I was invited to Abu Dhabi, it was a highly confidential conference with some senior politicians, and they changed the venue at the last minute to Dubai. So I've only been to Dubai, but it's certainly a very interesting part of the world. Whether it's a model for how the world could develop is probably a question beyond my pay grade. I'm not sure it has very significant demographic implications, but happy to be proven wrong.
I'd like to come back to what you said about participative grandparents and ask you about mothers, because I live in Germany, which of course has struggled for a long time with an ageing population and a falling birth rate. And to any woman who has had a small child and tried to work seriously in Germany, it is blindingly obvious why this is. 70% of German mothers, I believe, work under 20 hours a week, and that's not all by choices, because society makes it enormously difficult for them to work full time. There are almost kindergarten places. There's an awful lot of social pressure on mothers to stay at home. What types of economic storylines and narratives globally have emerged about this feminist issue, perhaps from Scandinavia, I don't know, somewhere where this works better? And how much do you think that equality in the workplace and provision of
Well, thank you for that question. I do have a chapter in my book, just as I've got a chapter on AI, I've got a chapter about the women issue, the feminist issue. And it was actually quite a long chapter when I went into the history of going back to Mary Wollstonecraft and her views on. I wrote a whole kind of history of feminism's attitude to childbearing, and it was hugely cut by my publisher. I think it's a really interesting question. Where I am, I mean, I don't know any pronatalists who want to go back to the 1950s. I think most people who see this as a problem. In fact, I gave a talk in Hungary, and I had the pleasure of meeting the young female Minister of Families in Hungary. Our previous Minister of Families actually became president. You know, the Hungarians take it very seriously. And, you know, even though Hungary is quite a right-wing place, maybe quite a reactionary place, according to some people, we were absolutely of one mind. It's not about going back to the 50s. It's about how we can invent a world in which men and women take equal burdens insofar as they can. We've got to be realistic. The women have to do the work of the actual bearing of a child. How we can build feminism for the 2030s and 2040s, where we say women have all the capabilities men have. They must have all the educational and business and work and career opportunities that men have. How do we combine that with having enough children to sustain our future? And that is, I think, the most difficult problem to crack. We did have some very good data on Scandinavia, as you raised, where we had some really good data which showed that where societies were more equal, where there were better provisions for women in the workplace and having children, the fertility rate was higher. I'm afraid a lot of that data is no longer valid because the fertility rate in the Scandinavian countries has now fallen quite significantly. But, you know, speaking, as I always say, my mother was the main breadwinner when I was a child. If I can devote myself to demography full-time, it's because I had a very successful career wife who also had 3 children that we brought up together. We probably changed as many nappies as each other. I have 2 daughters and a son, and my daughters had all the educational opportunities my son had and are pursuing their careers while having children. So we've got to crack this. We absolutely have to acknowledge that we neither are women going back into the kitchen exclusively, nor do we want them to. If the fundamental problem is too few workers per retiree, the solution cannot be sending half the workforce out of the workforce. So I don't have all the answers. I think, you know, I listen very carefully to my mother, my wife, and my daughters. And I'm very pleased there's a debate here, which I think is going to be announced, which I was asked to talk at. And I said, no, I'm doing this talk. And I suggested a young woman who I know who's writing on these subjects. And I think the way this is going to be cracked is by young women who are interested in it. You know, there's people, 60-year-old grandfathers like me are not going to come up with a solution. But I agree with every word you said. We've got to crack that problem. And it's not going to be cracked by me. It's going to be cracked by younger, better, and probably more female minds than mine.
Yeah, what would you say is the maximum population the world can cope with? You say we can feed everybody easily and we can house everybody easily, but we've currently got global warming completely out of control. So where would your maximum for the population be?
The maximum number of people the world can support depends on the state of technology. So if you look back in 1800, we got to about 1 billion people. Most of those people were poor and hungry. So clearly, on the basis of the technology of the year 1800, the world could not cope with 8 billion people. And now it can. I mean, it's not a perfect world, but we have enough resources in the world for everybody if we distribute them suitably. I am not suggesting endless growth of the global population. I am not suggesting that everyone should have 7 or 8 children in a world where most of those children will live. I'm looking at countries like South Korea, and we are heading in that direction, where each cohort, 100 grandparents makes 33 children makes 11 grandchildren. I'm looking at global population going down the plug hole, and that's what I'm worried about. If we could end up with a world where people on average had 2 to 3 and the population hovered gradually from 8 to 10 billion, I think we could more than manage with that. My concern is not hitting some Malthusian peak. It's the fact that more and more countries are very soon going to be facing a falling population. We already see quite major countries with falling populations. Germany without mass immigration, Russia, China, Japan. And given the shape of their population, that decline is going to accelerate significantly. So I think, I don't know, this isn't a very good analogy. Someone throws themselves off a cliff and they're sort of hurtling down towards the ground, and someone says kind of, well, what if you hit a cloud? I mean, perhaps that doesn't work, but that's kind of where I feel I am. We're not heading for a population explosion. We're heading for a population implosion, if you look at today's fertility rates and the direction they're going in.
Paul, thank you so much, both for the presentation and for the very cogent and thought-provoking answers to the question. I'll just tie up, if I may, one loose end. We're going to have a debate on this particular question, or a debate on a particular question associated with demographics. And the topic for debate, I have to get my glasses out to read this, is going to be, this House believes that the falling birth rate in the industrialized world is not a bad thing. Now, amazingly, the people in charge of the debate assure me that they've got people to actually speak in favour of this motion. But there you are, it takes all sorts to make the institution, and I'm sure you'll go along on March the 13th and contribute your 10 pennyworth to it. Paul's talk this evening, apart from being absolutely enthralling, I realised sees the subject of demographics in terms of numerous templates. One of the templates, of course, is the division of the world into countries, which has been going on for so long, and that's how we look at many of our demographic problems. And it occurs to me that during my lifetime I've been acquainted with 2 Chinese families, very different families. One Chinese family brought up in Singapore and moving to Britain, buying a house here, purely to assure the education of their children. That was the driving factor. The other Chinese family, moving, I met them in France, and they were in France for a number of years. They had one daughter under the Chinese one-child policy, and they weren't allowed to bring her because the Chinese state was certain that by holding the daughter back, they would get, at the end, their diplomats back to Beijing, and they wouldn't absolutely defect. And you might consider about the other template, which is the world of warfare, which we have at the moment with the Ukrainian war, and daughters fighting for the Russians. How many of those would defect had not the North Korean state made political provision to ensure that they weren't able to? The whole subject is vast, and it will affect our lives, affect the future of our countries, and it's a never-ending topic. I'm so glad that we got a professional demographer along to provide the realistic template this evening. Paul, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Very worthwhile and interesting presentation. At the end of February, we'll be going back to the regular standby of the science group, and that's mathematics. And we'll have a local historian coming to talk to us about a local mathematician. And the mathematician, in point of fact, is John Venn. Now, you may or may not have heard of John Venn, but I'm sure if you work in any sort of field, you'll have heard of Venn diagrams. And his influence on mathematics was much larger than that. And come along on the 27th of February and enjoy the next Science Group presentation. Thank you for coming tonight.
Good, well, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for all on our side, Paul. It was excellent. And I'll make a point of listening to your radio presentation in the future. Thanks, Lisa.
Well, I do a lot of podcasts, so...
Sorry?
I do a lot of podcasts, so,
yeah.
you know,
Sure.
some of it... I mean, you wouldn't want to listen to them all because they're pretty repetitive. They've all got their own audiences, so you can...
Of course.
Now, my wife is heading in this direction.
Okay.
I would get the bus, but in my condition...